On the morning of December 22, 1944, Private First Class Eugene Rowe knelt in the frozen cellar of a butcher shop in Bastogne, Belgium. His hands, numb from the cold, worked to tie a tourniquet around what remained of a young paratrooper's leg. The soldier, barely 19 years old, looked up at him and asked a question that Rowe had heard 17 times in the past 2 days. "Doc, am I going to make it?" Eugene Rowe was not a doctor. He was a medic with the 101st Airborne Division, and for 72 hours, he and men like him had been making choices that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The town of Bastogne was surrounded. 10,000 American soldiers were cut off from supply lines, from reinforcements, from hope. German artillery shells fell every 15 minutes. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below zero, and in the cellars and bombed-out buildings that served as aid stations, the medics worked without enough morphine, without enough bandages, without enough plasma. They worked knowing that every decision they made, who to treat first, who could wait, who was beyond saving, meant the difference between a man seeing his family again or dying in the frozen darkness of a Belgian winter. This is not a story about victory. It is a story about men who carried no weapons, who ran toward the sound of gunfire when everyone else took cover, who held the hands of dying soldiers and made impossible choices in the worst conditions imaginable. This is the story of the medics of Bastogne. Eugene Gilbert Rowe was born in 1921 in the small town of WWII, Louisiana, a place so remote it could only be reached by boat. His family spoke French at home, the old Cajun French that had been passed down for generations. His father worked as a trapper and fisherman. Life was simple, quiet, governed by the rhythms of the rising and falling of the water, the seasons of fishing and hunting. Eugene was the second of 5 children. His mother, a devout Catholic woman, taught him early that service to others was the highest calling. When neighbors fell ill, she would take young Eugene with her, carrying soup or medicine, sitting with the sick through long nights. She told me, Eugene would later recall in an interview recorded in 1987, that God gave us 2 hands, one to help ourselves and one to help others, and if you only ever used one, you were wasting half of what he gave you. Eugene was 17 when the war came to America. Like millions of other young men, he registered for the draft in 1942. Unlike many, he requested assignment as a medic. He didn't want to kill. He wanted to save. The Army sent him to Camp Toccoa in Georgia for basic training with the newly formed 101st Airborne Division. There, he met the men who would become his brothers, the paratroopers of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Medic training was intensive. 18 weeks of learning to treat gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns, shock, and trauma. They practiced on each other, on dummies, on whatever they could find. But nothing, no amount of training, no lectures, no practice could prepare them for what it actually meant to hold a man's life in your hands. While explosions shook the ground beneath your feet, Eugene Rowe was quiet by nature. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble with the other men. He wrote letters home to his mother in careful French. He read his small prayer book every night. The men of Easy Company called him Doc, even though he corrected them every time. "I'm not a doctor," he would say. "I'm just a medic." In June of 1944, Eugene Rowe jumped into Normandy in the early hours of D-Day. He landed 3 miles from his drop zone, found his unit by following the sound of gunfire, and spent the next 33 days treating wounded men in the hedgerows of France. He learned things in Normandy that weren't in any manual. He learned that men didn't always cry out when they were hit. Sometimes they just got very quiet. He learned that talking to a wounded man, keeping him calm, could matter as much as the bandage you applied. He learned that you could do everything right and still lose them. In September, he jumped into Holland as part of Operation Market Garden. More casualties, more young men bleeding out in ditches and farmhouses, more faces that would follow him into his dreams. By December of 1944, Easy Company had been fighting for 6 months with only brief respites. They were exhausted, under strength, and looking forward to what they'd been promised: a quiet winter in reserve, a chance to rest and regroup. And then, on December 18th, they got the orders. German forces had broken through American lines. In the Ardennes forest, a critical road junction, the town of Bastogne was about to be surrounded. The 101st Airborne was loading auto trucks immediately. No time to gather proper winter equipment. No time to requisition additional medical supplies. Eugene Rowe climbed into a truck wearing a summer uniform and carrying a medic bag that held bandages, morphine syringes, sulfur powder, and scissors. It was all he would have for the next week. Bastogne was not a large town. Before the war, fewer than 4,000 people lived there, but it sat at the center of 7 major roads, making it a critical crossroads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. On December 20th, German forces completed their encirclement. 10,000 American soldiers, most of them from the 101st Airborne, were now cut off from the rest of the Allied lines. The Germans controlled everything around them. Supply trucks couldn't get through. Reinforcements couldn't arrive. And worst of all for the medics, medical supplies couldn't be resupplied. Eugene Rowe set up his aid station in the cellar of a butcher shop on Rue du Neuf Chateau. The cellar was cold, so cold that plasma froze solid in its bottles. The ceiling was low, forcing men to crouch. Light came from a few flickering candles and one kerosene lamp. Within hours of arriving, the wounded began coming in. At first, it was manageable. A few men with shrapnel wounds, a paratrooper with a broken arm from a fall. Cases that Rowe and the other medics could handle. But on December 21st, the German artillery started in earnest. The Germans had the town surrounded and their artillery zeroed in. Every 15 to 20 minutes, shells would scream down into Bastogne. Buildings collapsed, streets became impassable, and casualties mounted. Rowe would later describe those first 24 hours in his testimony to military historians. You couldn't think too much. If you thought too much, you'd freeze up. You just moved from one man to the next, stop the bleeding, treat for shock, give morphine if you had it, move to the next one. The hard part was when you had 3 men who all needed you right then, and you had to choose which one to go to first. A combat medic's bag in World War II was designed to treat approximately 15 casualties before needing resupply. It contained bandages of various sizes, morphine syringes for pain, small tubes with a needle attached, sulfur powder to prevent infection, tourniquets, plasma bottles for severe blood loss, scissors to cut away uniforms. Eugene Rowe went through his entire bag in the first 6 hours. The Army tried to airdrop supplies. On December 21st, C-47 transport planes flew through heavy German anti-aircraft fire to drop bundles by parachute. Some bundles landed in German-controlled territory. Some parachutes failed to open, and the supplies were destroyed on impact. Some contained the wrong items, ammunition and rations instead of medical supplies. One bundle that landed near Rowe's aid station contained plasma, but the bottles had frozen solid during the drop and shattered. By the morning of December 22nd, Eugene Rowe's second day in Bastogne, he was rationing morphine. The aid station cellar was filling up. Wounded men lay on the floor, pressed close together for warmth. There wasn't enough room for everyone, so those who could still walk waited outside in the snow, their wounds temporarily bandaged. The smell in the cellar was overwhelming: blood, unwashed bodies, infection beginning to set in on wounds that couldn't be properly cleaned. Another medic, Private Ralph Spina, worked alongside Rowe. Spina was from Pennsylvania, a former grocery clerk who'd volunteered as a medic because, as he told Eugene, somebody's got to do it. The 2 men developed an unspoken system. Rowe would assess the incoming wounded, making quick decisions about severity. Spina would prepare treatment areas and manage the less critical cases. But both men were making the same terrible calculations. Triage, the word comes from the French verb trier, meaning to sort. In combat medicine, triage means dividing casualties into categories: those who will survive with immediate treatment, those who will survive with delayed treatment, and those who will not survive regardless of treatment. The third category, the ones who wouldn't survive, those were the men who haunted the medics. Eugene Rowe had to look at a 19-year-old boy with his intestines exposed and abdominal trauma and make the decision that he couldn't spare the plasma, couldn't spare the time, couldn't spare the morphine, because there were 5 other men who could be saved if he moved on. In his 1987 interview, recorded 43 years after Bastogne, Eugene Rowe still couldn't talk about those decisions without his voice breaking. You tell yourself you're saving more lives by making the hard choice. You tell yourself it's what you were trained to do. But at night, when you close your eyes, you see their faces, the ones you walked past, the ones you couldn't help. They're all still there. On December 22nd, the Germans delivered an ultimatum to the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe: surrender or the town would be destroyed. McAuliffe's response became famous. Nuts. The men cheered. It was a moment of defiance that lifted spirits. But in the cellar aid stations, the medics knew what it meant. No surrender meant more fighting, More fighting meant more wounded. More wounded meant more impossible choices. That afternoon, the German artillery intensified. Shells fell on Bastogne every 10 minutes, then every 5 minutes. Buildings that were still standing in the morning were rubbled by evening. Eugene Rowe spent December 22nd running from one aid station to another, trying to redistribute the few supplies he had left. At one point, he crawled through rubble to reach a wounded paratrooper trapped in a collapsed building. The man had a severe leg wound and was going into shock from blood loss. Rowe had one plasma bottle left. He used it, knowing that the next man who needed plasma wouldn't get it. The paratrooper survived. But Eugene Rowe never forgot that he'd had to make that choice one. Man's life waited against another's dot as night fell on December 22nd. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero in the aid stations. The medics couldn't light fires. The smoke would draw artillery. They couldn't move the wounded to warmer locations. There were none. Men began dying from exposure and shock as much as from their wounds. Eugene Rowe moved through the cellar, checking on each man. He held their hands. He prayed with them if they asked. He lied to them when necessary. You're going to be fine. The ambulance is coming. You'll be in a hospital by morning. One young soldier from Texas, barely 18, grabbed Rowe's hand and asked him to write to his mother. Tell her I wasn't scared. The boy said, tell her I did my duty. Eugene Rowe promised. He wrote the address on a scrap of paper and put it in his pocket. The boy died 3 hours later. That was the end of December 22nd, Eugene Rowe's second full day in Bastogne. He had been awake for 40 hours straight. He had treated 63 wounded men. He had lost 11 and he still had one more day to go. December 23rd began with a miracle of sorts. The clouds broke. For the first time in days, the sky cleared. That meant the Air Force could fly. Supply drops could resume. Medical supplies could get through. But it also meant the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, could fly. At 8:15 in the morning, German aircraft appeared over Bastogne and began strafing the town. Machine gun fire raked the streets. Bombs fell on what remained of the buildings. The aid station shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Candles were blown out. Eugene Rowe threw himself over a wounded man, protecting him with his own body as the building above them took a direct hit. When the attack ended, the cellar entrance was partially collapsed. It took 20 minutes to dig their way out. When Rowe finally emerged, he found that a parachute drop had landed just 2 blocks away. He ran through the snow, dodging debris, and found a bundle marked with red crosses. Medical supplies, bandages, sulfa powder, plasma that hadn't frozen, morphine syringes. Rowe grabbed what he could carry and ran back to the aid station. Other medics converged on the drop site, each filling their bags for the first time in 2 days. They had what they needed, but it wouldn't last. The German attacks had created a surge of casualties. All through the morning and into the afternoon, wounded men kept coming. A paratrooper with both legs shattered by a landmine. A lieutenant with shrapnel in his chest, struggling to breathe. A machine gunner with his hand blown off. A young private who'd taken a bullet in the neck and was drowning in his own blood. Eugene Rowe worked without stopping. His hands moved. Automatically now got away the uniform. Assess the wound. Stop the bleeding. Treat for shock. Move to the next one. Other medics were doing the same. Private Spina was in the corner, applying a tourniquet to a man's arm while simultaneously directing another soldier on how to hold pressure on a different man's wound. A chaplain, Captain John Maloney, moved through the cellar, administering last rites to those who were dying, offering prayers to those who were frightened. The chaplain and the medics worked side by side, one caring for souls, the others for bodies, both doing their best to bring comfort in hell. At 2 in the afternoon, the Germans launched a major ground assault on the American perimeter. The fighting was fierce. American paratroopers held their positions, but the casualties were staggering. The aid station was overwhelmed. Men were lying in the snow outside because there was no more room in the cellar. Eugene Rowe was trudging in the street, marking men's foreheads with his grease pencil, and M if he'd given them morphine, a T if he'd applied a tourniquet. He ran out of morphine again by 4 o'clock, which meant that for the next several hours, men in terrible pain had to endure without relief. One soldier with a severe abdominal wound begged Eugene for something, anything, to make the pain stop. Rowe had nothing to give him. He knelt beside the man and held his hand, talking to him, trying to distract him from the pain. "Tell me about home," Rowe said. "Where are you from?" The soldier, through gritted teeth, described his farm in Iowa. His wife, his 2 daughters, aged 3 and 5. The way the corn looked in summer. He talked for 20 minutes, Rowe listening to every word, squeezing his hand. And then he died. Eugene Rowe had learned something in medical training that came back to him in that moment. When you can't fix the body, you can still tend to the person. Presence matters. Being there matters. Even when there's nothing else you can do. By nightfall on December 23rd, the aid station had treated 96 casualties. 14 men had died. Eugene Rowe and the other medics were running on nothing but will. They hadn't slept in 3 days. They'd barely eaten. Their hands were raw from the cold and from constant work. Their uniforms were soaked with blood, but the wounded kept coming. At 11 o'clock that night, a shell hit a building near the aid station, and part of the roof caved in. 3 men were trapped in the rubble. Eugene Rowe and Private Spina crawled into the unstable structure to pull them out. The building was still settling. Beams creaked overhead. At any moment, the whole thing could come down. Rowe found the first man unconscious, severe head trauma. He dragged him out by his arms, moving slowly, carefully, every muscle screaming. Spina found the second man conscious, both legs pinned under a fallen beam. They couldn't move the beam. It took 5 other soldiers to lift it enough for Spina to pull the man free. The third man was already dead. They brought the 2 survivors back to the aid station and went to work. At some point during that long night, Eugene Rowe reached a place beyond exhaustion. His hands kept moving. His mind kept making decisions, but he felt separated from himself, as if he were watching someone else do the work. Years later, he would describe it to a military psychologist as going into automatic. Your training takes over. Your body does what it knows how to do, even when your mind can't process anymore. At 3 in the morning on December 24th, Christmas Eve, a young medic named Albert Moya came into the aid station carrying a wounded German soldier. The German had been shot in the leg during the earlier assault. He'd been left behind when his unit retreated, crawling through the snow until Moya found him. Some of the American soldiers protested. "He's German. Leave him." Eugene Rowe looked at the wounded German, a boy, really, maybe 17 years old, terrified and in pain, and made the only decision his conscience would allow: bring him in. He treated the German soldier the same as he treated the Americans. Bandaged his leg, gave him water, spoke to him in what little German he knew. "Du bist sicher. You are safe." The German boy looked up at him with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Dank." In that moment, in a frozen cellar in Bastogne, Eugene Rowe understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The enemy soldiers were just as scared, just as human, just as far from home as the men he was fighting. Alongside, they had mothers who worried. They had dreams that didn't include dying in Belgium. War made enemies of them, but suffering made them the same. The third day, December 24th, brought something unexpected. The Germans held their fire for a few hours on Christmas Eve. Not an official ceasefire, but a quiet that settled over Bastogne like the snow. Eugene Rowe finally slept. 2 hours, collapsed on the floor of the aid station with his medic bag as a pillow. When he woke, he checked on every man in the cellar, changed bandages, redistributed the wounded to make more room, coordinated with other aid stations on supply distribution, and at some point that afternoon, someone found a small Christmas tree barely more than a branch, really, and set it up in the corner of the cellar. The men sang carols, quietly, so the Germans wouldn't hear. Silent Night in a dozen different accents: city boys from New York, farm boys from Kansas, Cajuns like Eugene who sang it in French, Douce Nuit, Say Nuit. It was the first time some of these men had smiled in days. Eugene Rowe looked around the cellar at the wounded men, the exhausted medics, the chaplain quietly praying in the corner, and felt something he hadn't felt since arriving in Bastogne. Not hope, exactly, but something like it, the knowledge that even in the worst circumstances, human beings still reached for light, still sang, still tried to find meaning. The ceasefire, such as it was, didn't last. By evening, the shelling resumed, but on December 26th, elements of General Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was over. The wounded could finally be evacuated. Medical supplies came through in abundance. Fresh medics arrived to relieve those who had been working nonstop. Eugene Rowe walked out of the cellar aid station on the morning of December 27th, stepping into daylight for the first time in days. He had been awake for 72 hours, with only brief moments of rest. He had treated more than 150 casualties. He had saved dozens of lives, and he had made impossible choices that would stay with him forever. The Battle of the Bulge continued for several more weeks, but the defense of Bastogne became one of its most celebrated moments. The 101st Airborne's stand was featured in newspapers across America. General Eisenhower visited the town and awarded the unit a Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest honors an entire unit can receive. But for the medics, there were no parades. Eugene Rowe and the other medics moved on with their units, continuing to treat casualties through the rest of the war. They fought through Germany, all the way to Hitler's Eagle's Nest in Bavaria. Eugene was promoted to Staff Sergeant. He was awarded the Bronze Star for valor, though he never spoke about what he'd done to earn it. When the war ended in May 1945, Eugene Rowe returned home to Louisiana. He didn't talk much about the war. Like many veterans, he found it difficult to explain to people who hadn't been there. How do you describe making life and death decisions at 23 years old? How do you talk about the men you saved and the ones you couldn't? Eugene married and had children. He worked for a time, then eventually retired to a quiet life on the bayou, not far from where he'd grown up. According to his family, he kept his medic bag in a closet for years. His daughter recalled that once, when she asked him about it. As a child, he opened it slowly, showed her the instruments inside, and said simply, "These helped me take care of men who needed me." He attended a few Easy Company reunions over the years. The men he'd served with still called him Doc, still told stories about how he'd saved their lives. But according to those who knew him, Eugene Rowe never thought of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as someone who'd done a job that needed doing. Private Ralph Spina, the medic who worked alongside Eugene in that cellar, returned to Pennsylvania and became a pharmacist. He and Eugene exchanged Christmas cards every year until Spina's death in 1999. In one card, written in the 1970s, Spina wrote, "Sometimes I still wake up in that cellar. I hear the shells. I see the faces. Then I remember that we got most of them home. We did that, Doc. We got them home." The chaplain, Father John Maloney, stayed in the Army and eventually became chief of chaplains. He never forgot the medics he'd worked alongside. In his memoirs, he wrote, "I saw many acts of courage in the war, but none greater than the medics in Bastogne. They carried no weapons, yet they were the bravest men on the battlefield. They ran toward danger when everyone else sought cover. They held dying men and gave them comfort. They made impossible choices with grace. If there are saints among us, surely they are counted in their number." Today, Bastogne is a peaceful town. The war damage has long been repaired. Tourists visit the Mardassa Memorial, which honors the American soldiers who fought there. The Bastogne War Museum includes a section dedicated to the medics. Display cases hold the tools they used: bandages, morphine syringes, plasma bottles. Written accounts describe the conditions they worked under, but no museum display can fully capture what it meant. The medics of Bastogne weren't fighting the enemy. They were fighting death itself, in the worst possible conditions, with inadequate supplies and no hope of relief. They made choices that no one should have to make. Who lives and who dies? Who gets the last morphine syringe? Who gets the last bottle of plasma? Whether to spend precious time on a man who might not survive, or move on to someone with better odds. These weren't abstract ethical questions. They were real decisions, made in seconds, that determined whether young men got to go home to their families or died in a frozen cellar. In Belgium, Eugene Rowe lived until 1998. He was 77 years old when he passed away, surrounded by his family. At his funeral, 3 men from Easy Company attended, old paratroopers who'd been wounded in Bastogne and treated by Eugene in that cellar aid station. One of them, according to Eugene's daughter, leaned over the casket and whispered, "Thank you, Doc. We tell stories about combat, about the soldiers who stormed beaches and held positions against overwhelming odds, about the decisions commanders made and the battles they won. But we don't always talk about the men who came after the battle, the ones who crawled through the rubble to find the wounded, who worked in cellars and bombed out buildings, who held the hands of dying 19-year-olds and told them they'd be okay, even when they knew it wasn't true. The medics of Bastogne didn't win the battle. The infantry did that. The paratroopers held the line, but the medics saved the men who held it. Today, somewhere in Bastogne, there's a cellar that used to be a butcher shop. It's probably a storage room now, or maybe it's been filled in entirely. But for 72 hours in December 1944, It was a place where impossible choices were made with courage and compassion, where men like Eugene Rowe used to hands one to help themselves stay standing, one to help others survive, where the work was done not for glory or recognition, but because someone had to do it, and because every life, even in war, even in the worst circumstances, mattered. The medics of Bastogne remind us that heroism isn't always about facing the enemy. Sometimes it's about facing impossible choices with humanity intact. Sometimes it's about staying when everything in you wants to run. Sometimes it's about using your hands not to destroy, but to heal. To Eugene Rowe, Ralph Spina, Albert Moya, and all the medics who served in Bastogne, known and unknown, living in past, we remember the choices you made. We remember the lives you saved. We remember that you ran toward the sound of gunfire, not with weapons, but with bandages. And we remember that in the frozen hell of Bastogne, you showed us what it means to care for another human life, even when the cost is everything.